What is up, everybody? Welcome to another Hot Take of the Day podcast. I am your host, DRW David Ramsden Wood, coming to you from Scottsdale, Arizona, where the Ramsden Wood family has relocated to live out the zombie apocalypse that we're seeing going on in the world. Today, I'm actually excited about this one. This kind of came together in the last couple days. I have Rob Kalbouss with us. Rob, welcome to the show. Thanks so much.
Howdy.
So this is an interesting story. So Rob and I don't know each other, but I know he's followed the Hot Take of the Day on LinkedIn really since it started. And I'm going to get Rob to introduce himself and his background. But Rob and I are people who you would not really normally put in the same side of an issue. I would say that we probably are pretty deeply different. But what I've always enjoyed about every time he and I have engaged in an online discussion is it's always been respectful. It's always taken listening. It's never devolved into personal, and it's been intellectually honest. And so we've just, for the last probably 18 months kind of just followed each other and seen each other's posts and chatted. So I said, in this state of polarized politics and polarized governments and polarized responses to COVID and polarized responses to Russia and Saudi and oil and tariffs and everything, let's get someone on with a totally different view and have an intellectual conversation about stuff. So, Rob, why don't you give our listeners a little background about what you do, what you are, where you live, and maybe some political leanings, just so that they know my views. Let's hear yours. Let's go.
All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, David. This is fantastic. Like you said, I've followed the Hot Take for some time now, and always enjoyed the intellectual exchange that we've had, and I think that you do a great job of kind of curating that and putting incredible content out there, thought-provoking content. So my background, I currently develop grid-scale solar and wind projects in the Midwest. And so what that means is I help create the opportunity, decide where we should do this, and then go out and strike deals with the landowners. Work with the community to kind of gain their trust and acceptance, handle some of the permitting, basically everything that needs to happen before we're ready to sell the project, sell the juice, and finance it, build it. So that, and then kind of see it through to the end. And so I've been doing this. I've only been doing this about 9 months, but before that, I have a very broad energy background. And which started out in oil and gas, kind of coinciding with the boom of shale, and then later moving on to the power and utility side and kind of throwing myself at kind of clean tech startups to understand, what's creating demand out there. Why are people? What is the energy transition, and why is it happening? And kind of answering that to myself for the last few years before I started in solar and wind development.
And so where do you live?
I live in Indianapolis. I actually grew up in Indianapolis, but I haven't lived here for most of my adult life. I've spent first the East Coast, and then mostly in Texas, mostly in Austin, and a little bit in Houston before I came back to the Midwest about a year ago.
Okay. So wind and solar, grid. Talk to me about a couple of angles on that. Number one, have you seen in the last 30 days as COVID and energy, have things impacted your business yet with power prices or access or work or anything? Have you seen any impact since COVID-19 kind of took hold?
Absolutely. Some of the macroeconomics, microeconomics of it, they haven't really reverberated back to us yet, but definitely in terms of kind of the construction piece of it, it has definitely been kind of a stressor, but we managed to actually close financing and commission 31 turbines on a project that I've been working on in northwestern Ohio. And so that was very gratifying. As to what we also were able to kind of secure land and move forward in the key process with PJM, the grid operator. But as to what happens now, I think it's going to start to slow down. Things like financing are definitely at risk. Our customers might not have striking energy agreements, PPAs long term. That might not be top of mind right now. But that really hasn't happened yet. So I'm really speculating what could happen. But we're still working as hard as we can, trying to be as creative as we can to kind of build the pipeline.
So it's interesting to me when I think about the comparison of energy demand, right? So similar to oil and gas companies, we drill wells, so we go drill wells. We grow production, so we grow production. And we've obviously seen in a macro sense, because oil is very visible, what's happened to pricing. When you guys commission projects, I mean, how much work is done on demand and what demand for electricity? What are you displacing? Are you identifying the coal plant that you're displacing, or is it just sort of like build it and they will come? What's the strategy on that?
Well, I don't delve really into that strategy, but I can talk to it on a high level. So what we try to do is we try to go where there's scarcity for renewable energy, and that really starts to inform where we want to be. So, for example, right now in PJM, which is the largest grid in the world, it encompasses northeastern states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, New Jersey, Delaware, parts of Virginia, parts of Kentucky, parts of Indiana, and parts of Illinois. That grid right now, there's a lack of wind and solar. So that is kind of at the macro level where we're looking. Then when you get down to it, we're trying to find areas where there is available transmission capacity on the power lines, because we have to get our product to market. And then from there, it becomes kind of a question of, how can we build this at the lowest possible cost without running into environmental issues, without running into resistance from the communities, because we don't want to build this where people don't want it. We want to be there where people feel like they have a stake in it. And so we're trying to really find where that sweet spot is. And so that's kind of the process of how we kind of think about.
What kind of pushback do you guys have? I mean, I read that book. I'm sure you read it, the Superpower book. That talked about some of the challenges around transmission and interstates and utilities and et cetera, and certainly eminent domain. And it seems to me like the oil and gas industry is fairly regulated in terms of spacing and how landowners are treated and pooling and everything. What is it on the wind and solar side, and what kind of resistance do you get from the community primarily?
Well, mostly, I would say communities are very supportive, because this definitely brings money into the local economy. Creates jobs. We hire out of local union halls. We definitely support the community, and we try to do as much as we can to spread the wealth as much as we can. We want people to feel like they have a stake in the project. That said, that's not always going to be enough for everybody. Some people feel left out. Some people just have extreme views, on anything in this day and age. So we have to kind of work with them and find a way to kind of, I don't know, try to make them feel like they're stakeholders. And oftentimes, we're successful, but occasionally we're not successful, and it becomes you get tied up in litigation, or local governments will actually create ordinances banning or putting moratoriums on wind energy. And so we want to start by just avoiding that altogether and going places where we feel the communities are in favor of it. Yeah. And we build. We are rare kind of in the business. We are an owner operator. And so we try to have take a long-term view. We want to be in the communities, over decades.
So let me ask, in terms of, certainly and this will start to be one of the more, like, as we have different sides of the issue. It seems to me like there's the drive behind climate change and low carbon and providing energy. And then there's, what you're talking about is exactly, if I were to talk to an oil and gas executive around some of the challenges around the community, and it's good for some landowners and not for others, and there's extreme views, and we go and we develop, and it's, it's very local. So what do you sort of see as are there other drivers other than it's just good? Obviously you're in business to make money, and do you rank wind locations tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? Do you really see it as a either or, like oil and gas, or how do you see the relationship between wind and solar and oil and gas companies? Do you think oil and gas companies should be buying a company like PJM and sort of integrating the whole energy flow, or what's your take on that?
Well, so it's a lot of questions there. So I think okay, resource is not the main limiting factor on this. It's really getting product to market. Where can we get the product to market at the best possible price? There's resource. There's everywhere. I mean, I don't want to be. I guess that's not a good way.
There's wind and sun everywhere.
There's wind and sun everywhere, and we can make that. That usually is not the limiting factor. It is a limiting factor in some areas, but we can usually make that work if we can get the product to the market at a decent price. That's kind of how we look at it. And so, you might not think of Indiana as being this incredibly windy state, but there is plenty of wind here. It's allowed us to develop quite a bit. So the rest of it is really just kind of scarcity and just really economics. Now, should oil and gas companies get into? That's a really good question. I don't know. It's such a different business model. But if oil and gas really sees the market as shrinking, I personally think that demand for oil and gas will shrink over the next several decades. I think it would be probably someplace where they would want to have some exposure.
Now, do you differentiate oil demand from natural gas demand? I mean, we talk about coal.
Right, absolutely, I do.
And
I think it's completely different demand, but it's interesting because it's not always on the supply side. Can you really think of it as different?
Right. Because I mean, when I think about in 2010, and I think these numbers, you and I would be talking about them from the same perspective, is coal was sort of 45% of electrical generation in the United States in 2010. And now in 2020, it's roughly 25%. And the delta of that 20% has been made up for our power consumption is actually relatively stable because efficiency has gone up. Even though we used to have one television, now everyone has 10 televisions and like 4 iPads. But that wind and solar and natural gas piece has taken up 20% of that coal piece. So right. as we head towards coal zero, because again, these are older power plants. And to me, I think about utilities being relatively indifferent to what their power source is. They have an end customer and they have a cost. And they'll say things like, we care about the environment, but at the end of the day, they care about access to consistent power from a scarce supply, and that power plants for coal are old, they need to be retired, there's negative energy around them, but they also cost a lot. So it seems like coal is going away because of economics.
Right.
Wind and solar and natural gas will grow. Is there any limiting factor other than transmission for wind and solar, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, sure, absolutely. One of those would be just demand. Our customers are not necessarily power companies. So our customers are oftentimes just large C&I energy consumers, large commercial and industrial energy consumers.
Okay.
So you think like a data center. So one of the things they like about our product is that it locks in a price per kilowatt hour for decades. And so it's a hedge. It can also reduce their costs today, but it's also a hedge going forward. And that's something that they can't get from thermal generation, in addition to all the green attributes.
Right. Do you anticipate like guys like, I know Google has sort of, and Google and amongst others have sort of talked about going, I think, net carbon zero, and part of it is using wind and solar, et cetera, to power their data centers. Do you see those guys integrating the full supply chain and ultimately a Google buying a wind farm to lock in?
I can't see that. I can't see that happening. I mean, they will take down our entire supply, for example, for a wind farm. So, for example, like an Amazon, would take down our complete all the power generated from one wind farm. And so they don't need to own the asset to get that benefit.
Right. So your sort of forecast on natural gas demand in particular is you're just seeing more and more companies directly sourcing a wind or a solar or some provider that can lock in a guaranteed price at a guaranteed rate because it is a self-contained. They'll be able to use the power grid from normal utilities to be able to balance any surges in power. I suppose is that fair?
Yes, and so that kind of speaks to what you were, the earlier part of your question. You were talking about, do I see any limiting factors? Well, certainly we haven't seen integration of renewable energy on the grid become an issue yet, really, here in the United States. And that's happening. That's happened in Germany. And one of the reasons I think that we can expect less of that is just our geography. We have a much bigger geography that we can work with, so that if the wind's not blowing today here, it's blowing, over there. And so as long as we have transmission, sufficient transmission, then I think we can sort of get the benefits of the portfolio effect sort of working for us to handle some of that intermittency. And undoubtedly, some of that is going to need to be taken up by storage, and maybe efficiency measures like demand response.
Now, I know one of the more controversial topics, I think, and man, it feels like a decade ago, and I think it was like when the California fires were happening, and there was a lot of exposure to PG&E and some of the transmission lines, and questions around were they maintaining them well enough, were houses being put in environmentally sensitive areas so that we had these sparks being created by transmission. I mean, how do you see the existing grid in the United States, and how much needs to be upgraded to really be able to transition the supply, or is it really supplementing the supply for these cities?
Well, I mean, every time you put one of these on the grid, you have to do an upgrade to the system. And so that's being studied by grid operators like PJM, like MISO, ERCOT. They really require that. Now, they require kind of a system impact assessment, and that's handled throughout the process of kind of getting on there. Now, in terms of is there sufficient capacity, is there sufficient capacity to meet demand? That is starting to get a little bit over my head, yeah. But definitely there's a market that is supposed to handle that. It's supposed to be the arbiter of that process.
Do you feel like the same things if we look forward 10 years for wind and solar, and we think about, one of the things I found very surprising was that wind turbine blades erode because obviously wind and particulates, and so they lose efficiency through time. And I'd seen an article that talked about the challenges of recycling blades. Obviously, technology is coming along. But in 10 years, do you think that there's going to be the same negative push? We're killing birds. We're building on these lines. Like, what do you envision 10 years from now people are talking about?
I really don't see that happening. I think that, for example, birds, it's definitely an issue, and we do everything we can to mitigate it. But I don't see that a big public outcry emerging over, a handful of this relatively small bird take that the industry does have. I just don't see that being something that's going to get people up in arms like the issues with, say, global climate change. We're talking about local impacts versus global ones. And I think that's because of global climate change, that's something that can get people there's a lot more sentiment mobilized around that.
So you talk about, one of the interesting characters, I haven't talked to him, but I read some of his stuff. I think his name's Mike Shellenberger.
I've seen that name, but I'm not familiar with his.
He's an interesting cat because one of the things he was very involved in solar and wind, and he had done a TED Talk, which has obviously been circulated for lots of reasons, but was basically sort of some of the downsides of wind and solar in terms of just the mechanics of it. His view is we need to move totally nuclear. And I don't know if you listen to the podcast with Jigger Shaw,
yes,
where some of the challenges around, there's a mobilized group around wind and solar, and there's a lot of active investment. So there's a lot of money being put in space to be able to build these facilities, and nuclear doesn't really have an advocacy group who's arguing or discussing the pros and the cons. And then, as you said, oil and gas, there's a lot of people who are mobilized against it.
Right.
Which, again, climate change, I think, is certainly the lightning rod, but Mike has some interesting views on how ultimately we all move to nuclear. So I'm curious if you had a take on that.
I think I have seen some of this, right? The thing about nuclear is it's the economics of it are just a real challenge right now. And there is so much risk in making an investment in a nuclear power plant. I'm not talking about risk from nuclear fallout. I'm talking about the risk of putting capital at risk to build a gigantic 2,000 megawatt thermal plant is so much different. That risk profile is so much different than building a 200 megawatt wind farm. And so society, I guess, is better diversified, in my opinion, in building lots of renewable generation than going with these big thermal plants that take so many years. And right now, just if you look at it on the levelized cost of energy basis, it's just not competitive with natural gas or renewables. And I think you still run into some of the same stuff with big CGG2 plants with thermal with natural gas that you do with nukes. And I think that's kind of one of the advantages that we bring to the table over natural gas over the long term. But,
so, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No. I was gonna pivot a little. In terms of, we touched on climate change. I don't know that it does anyone really a big service to get into a climate change debate, because I don't really think it's, again, whether it's a debate or not, we need energy. There's different sources of energy, and it all comes down to economics. So to me, economics win. One of the things I have found interesting, though, if we do touch on climate change, is there's a lot of stats and a lot of people who push data on both sides of climate change denying versus climate change accepting. And I feel like there's a lot of parallels with the virus, COVID-19. And,
sure.
And I'm curious if you would certainly have looked at a lot of climate change data to facilitate a view. I've looked at a lot to facilitate a view. How do you think the virus versus climate change, the parallels and the non-parallels of the discussion that's now focused the entire media for the last 45 days?
Well, I'll just say to start that I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who is desperately clinging to the middle ground on pretty much
that's a hard thing to do. They call it the silent majority, but it's a very few number of people that sit in this very narrow band.
Exactly. I think extremism breeds extremism, and so I'm trying to avoid it as much as I can. And I come from a perspective on any issue, but I'm trying to cling to that center ground. As far as the parallels, I do think that people are going to start I think there's going to be more of an emphasis on listen to scientists. Scientists are telling us blah, blah, and such and such. And I think that's a good thing, because I think there's a general scientific illiteracy in our culture that is very disturbing. At the same time, I think that people really don't understand that science is a method and not a collection of facts. And that the problem is, if we all have a different collection of facts, then we can't really have an intelligent discussion. But if we understand that science is a method that's driven by skepticism and doubt first and foremost, then we can start to understand each other and a little bit better, and maybe have a more successful dialogue. And that's coming at it at a very high level. But that's my personal take on how to approach things like C19, like climate change, like our how we handle risk in society. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but we have to start with method and not this kind of fiction of facts that we have.
Well, and it is interesting, because I would actually say in the climate change narrative coming up to COVID, I had personally felt like there was more and more media coverage of it. And again, much like the virus, I felt that there was a narrative and that no one was providing the data. But then if you did provide the data, there'd be one person who would provide the data, and then someone else would provide some different data. And to your point, there was no one actually analyzing the same amount of data or having like an intellectually honest conversation about what the data even meant. And it was made worse by 30-second sound bites on media channels that would say, well, here's the answer. And people would be like, oh, that's the answer.
Well, that's true. But I think, people like Al Gore he was a data wonk, right? And people said he was boring, and that he was being too pedantic, and he probably was. But it's hard to strike the right balance between hearts and minds, and I think that's something that we'll always struggle with. And what the problem is, the more extremism that we have from both sides, I think it drives that wedge between hearts and minds even further.
How do you think that as a society we get to a better place? And this isn't a political show. If anything, I say that this is a data show. I've obviously, as you know, online, a lot of people don't love my COVID-19 response, and in part it's because I have not come out and just said like all of it. But then you get a lot of people being like, well, you're not a doctor. Well, I'm a data guy. I look at data. This is a data show. I'm curious, in politics, when there's this fight of hearts and minds, how do we ever get to a better place than we have right now with everyone talking their book and using whatever crisis of the day it is to advance their own personal agenda? How do you think, progress to a place where two people on different sides of the issue actually talk like we are today?
Well, one, I think, is owning the flaws in your argument, or owning the whole thing. We have to be able to willing to say that not everything is perfect, including my position, and that there are trade-offs. And acknowledging those trade-offs, I think, is something that people really have a hard time doing. And saying, there is a cost. It's not all benefit. That's a starting place. But I think in terms of dialogue, I think we have to keep the attention on the facts and looking at and going a step beyond the headlines and all the clickbait that's out there, and really getting into the facts. And something like COVID-19, let's really look at the numbers. How many people have died? How many people are projected to die? What is the economic impact of the response we've had? We really have to focus on kind of the numbers rather than the emotional toll that this thing could possibly take on us. I think that's really hard to do for people, because they're really, they're dealing with this at a very superficial level. All these issues at a very superficial.
Yeah.
And that's getting past that is I guess that's the question you're asking, and I'm not sure, but I think it is kind of focusing on the data, pointing to where it is on the internet, for example, and then maybe how to interpret, and then you can take things a step further to how do you interpret data? How does one go about doing that? And that's unfortunately a longer term thing. I've been blessed to have a great education in the sciences, scientific history. I've started doing this from day one as a kid, just because that's the way I grew up, and I had a lot of privilege as a kid to go to science camps and read science fiction, and instead of doing things other kids were doing. That's kind of, I'm steeped in it, but I don't know how you get the general public to at least a competency level.
And it does really worry me, because and I try not to be frustrated. But like, I remember specifically in junior high, there were people in my class that just couldn't do math. Like they wasn't a thing they wanted to do. They didn't pay attention. They didn't study. And then they went into, I'm not going to use this as a negative, but they went into journalism, and then they're writing these stories or on TV talking about it with no understanding of statistical significance, or some of these the economy. One of my biggest critics, and again, I hope I value criticism when it's about the data.
Yeah.
I don't appreciate the fact that everyone, usually when they don't like that they're not winning the argument, they degenerate into like a personal attack. Well, you don't have these qualifications. You're not a doctor. Well, okay, then tell me how you're not a doctor, but can tell me I can't interpret it correctly.
Sure.
But one of my biggest critics previously on my COVID stance, we've been emailing a lot lately about the economics. And this person said, look, I understand the health stuff. I don't understand the economics at all. I don't understand quantitative easing. I don't understand job loss. I don't understand the unemployment. Like, help me understand some of the economic impacts, because I will admit I was only looking at it from one side. And I admit that in a way where I don't really want to come out and say as bluntly what I feel as I feel, because people will take it very negatively if taken out of context. I'm limited in the way I can communicate. So it is interesting your take on data and that it's really hard to fix.
Yeah, I think that you have to walk very softly when you question people about things, and I think you have to say you have to present it. You have to be very careful how you kind of walk them down the path of, and always pose. I think posing things as a question is a very powerful thing to do.
Yeah.
What do you see when you look at this data versus look at the data, stupid?
Yeah, no, 100%. That's there is, unrelated to some of the other things, there is a reason I did get fired multiple times in my career. I didn't do a lot of walk me through how you see this in a different way. I was like, here's what the data says. Like, let's move.
Yeah, I've always been the one to pound the table. Yeah. And it's been a struggle for me to learn how to not just pound the table and say it's all right there. Isn't it obvious?
So walk me through, your take on COVID and things that you've seen change in the last month, what you think is coming, how you think people interpret the data, and give me a prognostication. I know a lot of people are saying Dr. Fauci was on yesterday saying, life may not go back to normal. I talked to a lot of people that are like, I mean, the second I'm out at a restaurant, I think I'm probably doubling down on going back to the way things were. So I'm curious, what you've seen a lot of data, you read a lot, you use the scientific method. What do you see? What do you see about the reaction? How do you nuance the balance?
Well, so I start by recognizing that this is a dangerous pathogen. It's very unique from what we're usually exposed to in the biosphere. And I think that danger is something to be taken seriously. And I think it's something that there needs to be a coordinated response to handle. Now, unfortunately, I don't think we have had a coordinated response. I think we've had a very haphazard response to this.
Totally agree.
And the haphazard is simply, let's kick the can a little by locking these people in their homes. I don't think that's very smart because no one is really doing the cost-benefit analysis there. And I don't think really people are thinking about what's coming down the pike. And all the research I shows is that we could have successive waves of infection. And while we might do some to mitigate kind of peak healthcare demand in the short term, well, what happens to kind of just this slow bleed on healthcare demand over time, especially when we don't have the economic strength to kind of adapt to that? And so I would prefer to see a response where we have a stronger emphasis on maintaining the economic strength, maintaining or decreasing the amount of impact to people who are already living at the margins. I think that's something that's really not being considered because then you start to get these complexities arising between, say, people who are losing their jobs and people who aren't paying creditors, people who are angry and maybe protesting maybe somewhere 6 months from now or something like that. I think it starts to make it much harder to handle a response to a pandemic. So I think we need to be a lot more deliberate in studying and kind of floating ideas around what a response is versus kind of. And here's another thing also. I got to mention this. The whole flattening the curve thing drives me absolutely crazy because I love the idea. I get the intent, and I'm all for reducing transmission. But the way that the concept is framed pseudo-statistically just really gets on my nerves because there is anything but statistical rigor being applied to kind of how our policies translate into a quote-unquote flatter curve. And so it's a metaphor. It's not anything that has any sort of reality on it in purely statistical terms. And I think that dumbs down the conversation. Makes people more prone to these reactive responses. You're not a specialist. You're not a statistician. Well, I do know a little thing. I'm not, but I know a little bit about statistics, and this is not statistics. It's a metaphor. Yeah. That drives me crazy.
It's totally crazy. And it also feels, I mean, your point totally on haphazard response. And again, it's sort of, maybe it's posing it as a question, but if everyone were to sit back and turn off the television, which I've done for the last 5 days because I was getting so frustrated listening to people. But if everyone were to say, like, have we responded in the correct way? I think almost to a person, everyone would say no.
Right.
I think that everyone would also say that the flattening the curve was a neat starting point, and it probably was the right starting point. But we've moved. It feels to me like we've moved past flattening the curve to like, oh my goodness, don't let me get this. Whereas if the true intent was everyone's going to be infected, a lot of people are going to be like have different results. We can't stop it. So we just want to maximize the ability and availability of hospitals. And then like Minnesota, state of 5 million people, 27 deaths. I can't imagine anyone is in the hospital beds there. And when we restart at some point and I'll start allowing travel, like Minnesota is going to peak because nobody has immunity because no one's been in contact with it.
Yeah, that's what I keep wondering. Nobody's had contact with it, and how do we get that herd immunity? Isn't that flattening the curve too?
It's what it was supposed to be. And so, you know, what I just we've migrated so far, and it's your point of like the politicians, the easy answer was, well, everyone else shut it down, I'll shut it down. And then the easy answer is, well, you shut down your restaurants, I'll shut down my everything, and then we'll shut down schools. And it's like politicians they're not rewarded for taking a nuanced position that makes everyone mad. It's like gasoline tax. If we pivot back to energy, it's like if you want to actually impact climate change and demand for oil, and you believe that oil is the problem, then you would use the low oil prices today to implement a gas tax so consumers wouldn't see the delta at the gas tank, but you would add a tax that would therefore reduce demand in the future, and you could use that money for supporting transmission lines or whatever. But politicians will never come out and say, I support a gas tax for any reason. So they default to blaming other things. And COVID feels the same way. No one's actually had a nuanced conversation around the response.
Yeah, there's no reward for sticking your neck out.
No, there's not.
It's so hard to kind of measure success, but it's so easy to point to failure. And that's, I think we could take that all the way back to thermodynamics. I mean, it's entropy, right? Systems tend toward disorder. They don't tend towards order. And human condition is subject to that as well. So I don't know how to get past that, how to fight those forces of social entropy.
Yeah, I mean, and the interesting thing, and I will say, so my wife and I kind of joke about it. I'm a self-described socialist Republican, and you know, I'm born in New York, grew up in Canada, live in the U.S. Hardcore capitalist, would generally vote Republican in almost every place, but because of my Canadian, but also like I really lean hard as a socialist. And I don't mean socialist like in the conventional sense, but like, do I believe that in a safety net for Medicare? Absolutely. Do I believe in better access to education across everywhere? Absolutely. Do I worry about the 130 million people that don't have $400 for an emergency, and those are the people that were being marginalized right now? Absolutely. So it's this sort of like, you know, little L Republican, I guess, with a little Canadian slant. But it's been interesting because in the last little bit, I've found myself really becoming a lot harder core conventional Republican, and like watching Fox News because I can't watch CNN, and listening to Donald Trump, who, like, and I always said, if he could just take away the tweeting and just focus on the policies, it would be better. But now, like, I listen to him and I find myself agree. Yes, absolutely. And it's weird how polarizing even this issue has made the world. I don't know if you found yourself the same way, but I tried not to regress, but I have regressed massively.
I come at it from a similar perspective. So I grew up in Indiana, to a child of Russian immigrants whose families were driven out of Russia by Bolsheviks. And so the idea of being anything but a patriotic capitalist, it was just anathema to them. And so I grew up very, very steeped in that tradition. Don't let the long hair fool you. I am a greedy capitalist.
I just assumed it was because you can't get access to a barber. Neither can I look like a bushman by the end of this thing.
I'm a prepper, so I had a little advanced preparation for the pandemic, for the plague here, for the apocalypse. But I went to Catholic school, and one of our teachers, beloved teacher of mine, said, "We're educating you to be capitalists with consciences." And that's kind of the way I've always looked at it. I believe in social investment and things like education and healthcare to keep income, some sort of social safety net. But at the end of the day, I really believe in the power of markets. I really believe in the idea, that Milton Friedman advanced, that economic freedom leads to political freedom. So I'm coming at it from that. At the same time, I think that there are just some things where we're failing because we've kind of assumed that markets are super efficient machines that can solve any problem. And I think that we need there's a role for government to play in kind of making markets more efficient, or maybe just doing what markets can't.
Right. But then back to the point we were having just before that is that you need government intervention, but there is no reward to politicians to taking a nuanced view. And so, for example, politicians saying, look, we've now had, basically New York's been on shelter in place since March 20th. California, who still has there's so few cases. It's shocking to me that California shut down earlier than basically anywhere else. And of course, people are going to say, well, social distancing is working, blah, blah, blah. But we've given the hospitals now a month to prepare. But no politicians coming out being like, okay, we're now ready. We're going to go out, but you're going to wear masks. Not because you want to wear masks, but because we need to restart the economy. And we're going to start restaurants again, and people are going to get sick. And if we need to moderate, but we want people in the hospital. We want to fill up the hospital, fill up the beds, and we're going to just kind of balance it. But no, these politicians that are supposed to be intervening to help free markets aren't incented to do anything. And then we end up in just stay in your homes. And at some point we have to come out of this. And I'm terrified for what happens when we come out of this.
I agree. And, unfortunately, we have the government that we've chosen. And I think that influencing that choice is more of a long-term project. And I think that starts with really trying to be as moderate as you can. I don't have television because I can't watch any of it. It just, those news programs are useless to me.
Yeah, I agree.
I read, I have a stack of books. I read white papers. I follow Reuters when I really want to get the headlines. But I can't do the news stuff because it's newstainment, and it's made to provoke an emotional response. It is specifically made to keep you tuned in to get that emotional hit. And I just think it's destroying people's ability to kind of think through this. Back to the whole emphasis on analysis and cold analysis of facts.
Well, and the very unfortunate piece, and this is the biggest concern I have, is that most people are watching newstainment and hearing the soundbite in that movie, The Big Short, which I love. They're sort of of course, everyone has a soundbite that they can talk about at parties, so they sound smart, but you didn't really understand what was going on. And those sound bites come from the television, and that is driving the emotional response and any discussion online right now, especially. I've been very active saying I disagree with it, and the shouting down and the shaming. And a friend of mine went to the store to buy eggs the other day, and some woman screamed at him for not wearing a mask, and he was 20 feet away from her.
Right.
And so we've gone just so far beyond rational response to anything, and any discussion that's counter your view, you just yell down. And I don't know how we fix it, especially since we have such an economic calamity coming.
I would say, for me, it's doubt. I subject my beliefs to constant scrutiny. And taking this back to energy, when the first downturn in crude prices happened at the end of 2014 throughout 2015, I took it really personally. Why didn't I see this coming?
Because you were in energy. You were in oil and gas.
I was at an oil field services company. I was a market research analyst. I come from the investment world as a stock analyst, consulting before that and so I took it really seriously, and I started to ask myself questions. What have I been missing? And that's kind of my approach. And that led me to an interest in the power and utility space and what brought me over here, because I subjected my belief system to scrutiny. And when I did that, it expanded my intellectual horizons. And it's not that I didn't love oil and gas. I mean, I guess I had a love-hate with relationship, but there was a lot of love and a lot of self-identification with the oil field. But at the same time, I wanted to subject myself to scrutiny and understand and kind of expand my horizons by doubting first and by putting a little skepticism on some of the assumptions that I had made, because a lot of them turned out to be wrong.
So a lot of our certainly colleagues, you were in oil and gas, you went through this before you transitioned. A lot of our colleagues, especially with the demand drop, and really what I say, March 7th was the change of energy. I think we've had cycles before. This is not that. Just like this is not the 2008 financial crisis. This is like an instantaneous demand or destruction, government intervention, world economy halting. We've never seen that. We've never seen Saudi and Russia get in a price war, and we've never seen demand destruction of 30 million barrels a day. So as so many people are going to be furloughed and unfortunately laid off, you went through the process of self-actualization and thinking about it. Give our listeners some ways that they could, some ways they could go through the same process you went through and find out where they could spend their time and their passion in their future career, given that energy just is not going to really be a large employer go forward.
Well, the first thing is you got to figure out what you're good, how to generalize what you're good at, and that's not always easy. If I had just identified myself as an oil and gas analyst, I would not have been able to kind of make the jump as successfully as I did. But I learned that I was good at communicating. I learned that I was able to kind of build consensus around new technologies, because as an analyst, one of the things I had to do was figure out how to get my data, get my analytics out to people. And so I had to kind of look at myself from a new perspective and say, well, the energy transition involves lots of new technologies, and it involves building consensus to build energy projects, for example, like what I'm doing right now. And I had to look at those skills of communication and getting people to kind of adopt new systems and new processes for doing things. I had to kind of generalize that and say, okay, how do I get that? How do I bring that to bear on what I'm interested in? Since I wanted to stay in energy, it was easy to look at the energy transition as the next step. But I could have easily taken those skills to the tech world and help people figure out how to get users on a frozen yogurt efficient marketplace, or whatever the geniuses of Silicon Valley are thinking of these days.
Right.
Like that. You got to generalize. You got to take what you're good at, and kind of be imaginative and think about how that solves other people's problems. That's going to apply whether you're wearing coveralls or whether you're wearing a three-piece suit and sitting in boardrooms, or everything in between.
Yeah, I'm pretty concerned when this quarantine ends. I'm not sure any of my pants are going to fit anymore. I basically just walk around in pajamas. But anyway, so is there anything that you want to talk about?
Is there anything I want to talk about?
Yeah, I've been asking all the questions. Any hot topics that you want to get off your chest?
Any hot topics? Well, I really kind of the burning one thing I want to talk about is the flattening the curve thing, and I think I hit that pretty hard. Let's see. I want to see what do you think? Where do you think shale goes in the next, say, 5, 10, 20 years? What's going to happen as that model changes, and what is going to be the driving force?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, long before March 7th, I have been saying that the U.S. needed to stop growing production and shut down rigs and restore balance sheets. That was just an industry health comment. We unfortunately grew 1 million barrels a day from where we were, and unfortunately we deployed, $50 billion in capital that could have been used to restore the balance sheet in 2019. And so that now, and again, a lot of people would love to say, well, companies should pay rent right now because, they should have saved for a rainy day. But COVID changed demand for restaurants the same way the Saudi-Russia battle March 5th and 6th and 7th changed oil forever. So, we were always going to end up, in my opinion, at 10 very large companies, 10 Exxons, Chevrons, EOGs. They're all going to consolidate, and it was going to take 3 to 5 years. And companies were going to have equity that was valuable because oil was going to be 55 or 60. And they could use that equity to merge and consolidate and not do cash and reduce G&A. And people could then get severance packages and be able to transition, as you did, out of the industry. And it was going to be hard, and it was going to be painful, and it was going to unemploy a lot of people, just like coal has done. But there was going to be an orderly unwind. Then we had this demand event, and every company is basically worth zero in the United States. Every company in Canada is worth zero. And honestly, Saudi and Russia, no one likes $20. And there's no reason, even if this OPEC thing happens, there's no reason that oil should be trading at 35, because every day we're putting 20 to 30 million barrels a day in storage that someone's buying at 25 and will resell at something somewhat higher. Mm-hmm. And so they can leak that oil into the market. And so I think oil probably is a $30 to $40 commodity for the next 18 months. Which means that all U.S. E&P activity, which is what I said in my post March 7th, all capital will go to zero. There will be zero completions, and there will be basically zero drilling, which means the U.S. will decline to 7 or 8 million barrels a day of oil in the next 18 months. When that happens, there will be a very large question in the U.S. about our future energy policy, because I called peak oil in the USA before COVID. November 2019 was the highest we'll ever produce, and that was 4 months before COVID, and then this has just exaggerated it. We've run out of inventory. We've drilled wells too close. We have horrible balance sheets, and shale was getting to the end. Yeah. So oil is going to decline. Natural gas has all this capability, and we need energy. I think that this geopolitical Russia-Saudi thing could lead to the American consumer saying, in the next 10 years, my next vehicle I want to buy is electric because I don't want to run it on oil. So right. I do think that, shale oil is going to be very difficult to get investment in for the next ever, because A, there was not a great inventory, B, all the rock is owned, C, the balance sheets suck, and now oil is depressed in pricing, and Russia and Saudi could go like that any second and crush prices. Right. So I think the U.S. starts focusing less on oil as a transport, more on natural gas as a transport, because, notwithstanding the natural evolution of coal shrinking and wind and solar will power some electricity. But if we move, there's 283 million passenger vehicles in the United States. If we move 100 million of those to electric in the next 5 years, the electric grid needs to be so enhanced that really only natural gas can instantaneously provide that. So that's the moment I see, is that oil becomes less important, shale gas becomes more important, it's cleaner anyway, and that the globalization that's occurred over the last 30 years is going to become much more local, because Americans might be willing to pay more for goods made in America instead of making things overseas where we offshore our pollution to anyways. Right. So I believed this long before COVID. I just thought it was going to take 3 to 5 years to occur. A slow decline in oil. We realized we weren't energy independent. We reduced inventory. And then the American consumer in 3 or 4 years woke up and said, man, we have this natural gas. We should use that. I think that this is going to accelerate that to 6 months. So natural gas will be the fuel of the future. Oil won't gain a lot of investment, and it will change the whole climate change debate much faster than I thought it would. So that's sort of what I foresee.
So what do you think about what went wrong that what we can learn from, so that we don't get what happening again? Say if there was this kind of real big push to drill natural gas. I certainly have a theory about it. I'm curious what you think about it.
Look, this is the age, this is the debate. And I will remember vehemently coming out of 2008. And for 10 years, I was effectively not invested in the stock market. So, of course, you get freaked out and you sell, and then you stay out of the market for the recovery. And then all the financial planners say, well, you can't time the market, and in 20 years, the market will be higher, and blah, 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 blah. At the core, the mistake of capitalism is the enticement to use debt instead of equity to supercharge returns.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what business, airlines, hotels, restaurants, consumer goods, everyone uses debt. And when you use debt because you have to repay it, the market goes like this and like this and like this. And so the change I think that has to come out of this for everyone is not about should companies have better social engagement and engage their customers. It's you can't use that amount of debt. And if you have less debt, less housing debt, less consumer debt, less student debt, then the stock market's just not going to perform as well. But
how do you think PUDs kind of played into that debt, that huge growth of debt in shale? Or do you think it
wasn't PUDs. It was access to cheap capital. Is that like even when you could go ahead?
But it was secured on something, right? It was supposedly secured on those PUDs.
It was mostly PDP.
Mostly PDP. Okay, so okay.
So yeah, I mean,
there's still a lot of assumptions embedded in PDP that really were glossed over, I think. And this I think there were a lot of perverse incentives to kind of book a lot more reserves than you really could because the debt was so cheap. As long as you had some sort of reasonable basis, and the problem is the basis wasn't reasonable in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, so it is, but to really understand the crisis, we need to go all the way back to 2008, which was the rest of the world economy. The way it feels for all the young people right now who are under 30 who weren't alive and your parents were freaking out in 2008, you now know why. Because 2008 actually, like, it was like a longer duration, but it felt this shitty. It felt horrible. Here, there's even optimism, like of a V recovery, and this is just short term. But imagine like every bank failed, and every company was failing, and everyone was being laid off, and it was just the end of the world. House prices were just collapsing. And in 2008, the only industry that was working was oil, because oil was trading at 80. So all the banks that used to loan money for mortgages, that would generate their fees from mortgages, had all this capital from the government that they had to deploy. And the only industry that made sense was oil. And on top of that, we had just found the Bakken in terms of horizontal development. We had just found the Eagle Ford in terms of horizontal development. And it kicked off a 5-year wave where oil went from 80 to 100 plus. And it was so capital intensive that like you just couldn't pour enough capital here until 2014. Then 2014 happened, and the companies never rebuilt their balance sheets because the banks in 2008 had learned if they foreclose all the houses, the world goes into a 6-year deep recession. And so the banks allowed companies to restructure, but we didn't have the bankruptcies we should have had in 2014.
Yeah.
And therefore, the debt maintained on the balance sheet, oil recalibrated to 50, and the Permian wasn't being drilled before 2014. I mean, it was, but like it wasn't important. So everyone thought the U.S. industry was innovated its way from $100 oil to $50 oil, but really it was the Permian was the only basin that kept growing because the Permian had been really found horizontally in 2013, 2014. So we covered up all of the mistakes of 2008 to 2014 with high debt. At the same time, the Permian worked at 50, and banks just took all the money that they loaned in one, and then they kept loaning for Permian. And so then the balance sheets never, ever, 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 ever got fixed. And then the same thing that happened in 2014 happened March 7th. And then the world changed forever. So it was... Go ahead.
Do you see the government using, or the Fed maybe using a balance sheet to help kind of sort through some of this?
I mean, I wrote a white paper in March that talked about it, and yes, I think that it needs to, because there's like 2 million people who are employed in energy, in oil and gas extraction and all of the associated. And $20 a barrel just doesn't work. And all of the high yield debt market, of which 15% of all high yield corporate debt is energy companies. And so you really risk collapsing the high yield corporate debt market, which will impact all other elements of the economy. And even just to have any level of energy independence or stabilization, so Saudi and Russia can't be, the whole debate in 2000 was we don't have an energy policy that protects North America or the United States specifically. We solved it, and now we're going back to it. So I think the government should guarantee the loans of companies until demand returns, so that we don't have just this mass bankrupt, just the same way they're doing for restaurants. My buddy has 2 restaurants in Denver. Took him 2 years to open the first, mortgaged everything. First restaurant was going phenomenal, had 60 full-time people. It was amazing. It was always full. Opened a second restaurant, just opened 6 months ago. It was amazing. Well, he's now had to lay off 120 people, and he has until June 1st, where if he doesn't get a small business loan, both restaurants fold and he loses everything.
Yeah, and that does nobody any good.
So for oil and gas companies, did they have a problem? Yes. Were they working through it? Yes. Should they have been raising production guidance in coronavirus in February? Should they have all said, like Nike said, we're going to revise guidance? EOG is saying we're going to grow production next year when they knew oil demand was down. It made no sense. But guarantee the debts to allow companies to at least get oil prices back to a $30 or $40 level, let demand return, and then encourage them. Don't give them capital because the markets won't. And they merge. And then they lay people off with appropriate benefits. Then the OFS companies can lay people off with appropriate benefits. Use tariffs if you need to get cash to guarantee the debts and to pay people a transition wage. And then when the economy is back to the way it sort of was, but at least like we're out of our houses, then more natural evolution can happen. Because it's like the hangman, they say it's not the fall that kills you, it's the quick stop.
Right.
And that's what we did. And I think that's what, if I were the federal government, I would be guaranteeing loans just to give a little bit of runway so it doesn't have to be this unwind financial event.
Do you see taking equity positions in some of these companies to help sort of hydrate some of these asset bases and maybe take some of the shitty assets off these companies and then kind of recapitalize the industry that way? Do you think that's a possibility that is practical?
So I wouldn't, and for those who have heard me speak in the last 6 months before this, I said 95% of oil and gas companies at a $55 price deck were overvalued. And so even at $55, I would have thought EOG should have traded at 35. I would have thought Contra should have traded at 30, and they were trading at 80 or whatever. So they were overvalued, and now at $30 oil, no company has any value because all of their PUDs, whether they're booked for debt or not, you can't drill any wells at these prices anywhere. Exxon can't, Chevron can't, no one can. There's no Gulf of Mexico. There's no conventional oil that's coming in to backfill this stuff. Like the industry's dead. So I would never tell the government to take an equity stake when, to me, all equity in the country is worth less than the debt. But what I would do is I would guarantee the debt so that prices can come back to a more normal level and demand can come back to a more normal level so that people can then evaluate and allow companies to use their paper, because their cash expenses are interest and G&A. Yeah. And if you just use your shares and the companies all buy each other and lay people off and reduce activity to match the low rigs and the low completions, and they'll do it themselves, but they have to have their debt guaranteed to allow that to happen in an orderly way.
I see. I see. So that is the incentive to do it, to give them the breathing room to actually think creatively instead of having to just keep drilling to maintain cash flow to kind of meet obligations. I see. That makes a lot of sense.
And again, I mean, and I think this conversation here is a microcosm of the challenge of communication. Is, I write, as you know, a blog every day for 18 months. And this is what I say. And I give speeches and I do podcasts and I talk about that exact thing. But people's learning style honestly is very individual. And unless you're engaged in a one-on-one conversation where it's like dialogue instead of like a one-way consumption, it's very hard to understand that. And so when I'm posting stuff online about COVID or about peak oil or about shutting down fracks, people take their own window and without feedback, they say, well, you can't shut down completions because if you do, I'll lose my job. And I'm like, yeah, but for the whole industry, we can't and you go through all of that. And this, again, is the challenge because every person has an individual view. And unless you're talking to an expert on that topic, you can't consume fast enough to become an expert too.
Yeah, I absolutely take your point. We don't have the ability to kind of join a conversation. It's just these quick kind of blasts into social media that we kind of mistake for discourse.
Yeah, well, I mean, Rob, I've loved this. I've always loved your comments, and we do come on different sides of different arguments all the time. But like I said right at the beginning, I love that we can have a different opinion and we can talk about the issues and not talk about the person. And I don't need to talk about your hair or your or living in Indiana to make my point. And so I hope, for listeners, I hope this has been a fun conversation, but also as you think about engaging with people on different sides of the aisle, there's no reason we can't learn from each other and grow with each other, because more important than ever, when this economy restarts, we got to get stuff right, because otherwise this thing comes to a crashing halt. So thank you for joining me, Rob.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was a blast, man.
Awesome. So as always, guys, you can email me anytime, drw@hottakeoftheday.com. Go to the website. You can read all the old blogs. If you have any questions about things, you can always shoot me an email and we'll have a dialogue. More often than not now, I'll probably just pick up the phone and call you and walk you through, or we can have a conversation. Old podcasts on the web. And until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day. Bye for now.